We're live now. Watch out.
It looks like we are alive, but we're going to give a couple of moments to anyone who might join. We're alone here, by the way, so far.
Nice.
Okay, now people are joining. I see quite nice turn up. We got 25 people joining in the first 10 seconds. So you've been waiting, folks. It's here. We're finally here talking about Cypress at scale. And we are live actually on a couple of different places. We're live here on StreamYard. You can find us on YouTube. We should be live on LinkedIn, I believe. So we're spreading the word all around the world, and it's been great. Okay. Hey there. Hey everyone. Feel free to say hi. We'll give ourselves a couple of minutes to wait for anyone who still wants to join. In the meantime, I do have a question for you all in the chat, and feel free to just leave a message there. How many tests do you currently have in your test suite? We're going to be talking about Cypress at scale, and that's going to include a lot of tests, right? So I'm curious about how many do you currently have. How are you, Jonathan? While we wait for the answers.
I find myself severely dehydrated today. It's just been it's been an interesting time being on vacation. But I got sick like 2 days ago, so there's like all this perfect sunshine, and of course I'm not feeling 100%.
Yeah.
Which is cool. But I'm excited about this webinar. It was cool to look back at Cypress again and see a few of the things that they've implemented over the last 2 years or so. And I also really like how you're approaching this webinar. I think it's a lot different than what we did last time with Playwright at Scale.
Yeah.
But I think it's gonna be really fun. So I'm excited to be here.
It's I'm looking forward to this as well. I'm glad you're here, that you made it beside like in spite of the COVID and the vacation. I don't know which one is the bigger barrier here. But glad to be with you here. Alrighty, we got some answers. Thank you for those. We got people with 700 tests, 250, 500, currently 40 in a startup, 250 in last company, approximately 500 tests. It's interesting. That's a lot of tests. So if anyone else wants to chime in, share how many tests. 2,000. Oh my God, Elise, that's crazy. That's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot of tests.
The interesting thing is, right, like, okay, you have this many tests. Okay, I like that some people are saying end-to-end tests specifically, right? Because when I see like 2,000 plus tests, is that end-to-end tests? Because my mind is being blown right now.
Yeah, that's either a huge application or it's I don't know. It's probably a huge application. I'm as far as I'm concerned.
I wonder if before we move forward, I wonder if Prodescu is in the middle of refactoring, because knowing 467, right? That's such a very specific number. I feel like he's counting the tests.
Yeah, he's probably deleted like 10 of those today. All right. So let's get started. Thank you for all the answers in the chat, and feel free to keep the chat active. We're going to keep an eye on it, and we're going to be answering questions, right? So big part of this experience, if you will, is the Q&A. We want to make this webinar useful for you, and hopefully it will be that way. So let's start. I'm going to share my screen now. We are at Cypress at Scale webinar. Welcome, everyone. And before we start, I know there's some people who maybe don't know me or don't know you, Jonathan. So let's start with a short introduction. and then we'll continue on to the meat of the of this webinar. So yeah, Jonathan, glad to have you here.
Okay,
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, I'll go for it. So I'm Jonathan Canales. I'm a senior solutions engineer at Checkly. Checkly is a synthetic monitoring solution that essentially uses Playwright under the hood to help you reuse your tests for running against production or any other live environment. And that's just putting it lightly. Prior to that, I worked at Cypress for about 2 years as a lead strategic customer success manager. So working with some of the largest organizations that leverage Cypress. So I learned a lot, asked a lot of questions, and I think along the way, I became something of maybe an expert. I'm not sure yet. Mainly, I
sure. Pretty sure. You're an expert. You run your tests on production, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I'm super glad. I'm super glad to be here. Mainly, I ask a lot of questions, and I think sometimes that helps me learn things. Filip, I'd love to get your quick bio again.
Really happy to be with you here, Jonathan. All right, my quick bio. My name is Filip. I work as a DevRel at Replay.io, and I teach testers about web development and developers about testing. So if you want to learn either or, you can follow me on LinkedIn. By the way, that's the QR code for my LinkedIn. If you want to connect, if you want to chat, my DMs are always open. So feel free to hop in and just talk about stuff. I'm happy to do that. I am a Cypress ambassador. I have a Learn Cypress.io community on Discord, and I publish my learnings on philiphric.com, where I publish mostly Cypress tips, but I've been delving into Playwright as well. Jonathan has pulled me into that world, and I have to thank him for that. So my first Playwright video came out last week on my YouTube channel. So you can watch that if you're interested in like joining me on the journey of learning a new tool. I mean, I've been learning it for a time, but I waited so long to make my first video. All right. So let's go through the agenda of today. So we have some topics we want to cover today. We'll first off start by introducing the whole topic, right? Cypress at scale, very short name for a webinar, but we do have lots of things to talk about. So we talk about like when and why we should start talking about scaling. We've seen some people who have 40 tests, some people who have 2,000 tests. It's probably worth noting like when is it important to start even thinking about scaling your project, right? We'll talk about some guiding principles, basically places we're coming from to like understand and give our perspective on how you should scale your Cypress project. We'll talk about test design, readability, project design. We'll finish it off by running on CI and maintenance. And at the end, if we have time, I'm sure we will, we're going to be answering your questions, but you can post your question at any time. We'll be happy to answer that. All right, so let's start with the first sort of an introduction, right? Scaling, when and why. What do we mean by scaling? That's the important thing I want to answer with this introduction slide, right? Because the first thing that comes to mind is that the scaling happens when there are certain number of tests in your test suite, but there's actually more to that, right? We have a couple of examples. You can have, growth of the test number. You can have growth of the execution time, right? Growth of the project itself that you are testing, or growth of the services. You have like multiple services or multiple apps that you are testing. And very importantly, growth of the team. And each of these poses a different problem, right? Some of these require you to decide early in the project. Some are okay to decide later. And generally, there's a very simple threshold that gives you a clear signal that your project is on the scale up trajectory, and that it is no longer possible to maintain it with only 1 or 2 people, right? That's where you start scaling, because sometimes when a project has 100 tests, that's where more people collaborate with that, right? Sometimes it's when you have 500 tests. Sometimes you can have just 30, but they're all on different projects, and you have to think as a team. You have to think about the future and now about how to scale that.
Yeah, I think something I'd add here, right? And I love that we opened up by asking people, how many tests do you have in your test suite? And we saw a full on gamut, right? With Alice saying 2,000 plus. But we also saw some folks share 40, right? Or like maybe a mid range amount of tests, like 250, 300, et cetera. And I think what we can kind of clearly start saying here is that, what does test scaling mean, right? Test scaling means someone other than you cares about these tests, right? Someone other than you is impacted by these tests, by its readability, the functionality, right? Like how fast they run or don't run, like to everything that Filip is pointing out here. It takes on this new life, right? The tests are beyond you, just like an app's code goes beyond a single developer, right? So some of us may be inheriting very mature end-to-end test suites. Some of us may be writing the end-to-end test suites for an app that has no coverage whatsoever. And I think the thing that Filip and I are trying to align on here around Cypress at scale is thinking about a solution at scale is going to help you and your organization save time, save money, and keep your velocity, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think you said that really well. All right, so let's now move on to the guiding principle, right? Uh, these guiding principles are something that guides the decisions for the recommendations we're going to be giving out today. And I want to put them out there because there are many questions that you might ask to which the "it depends" is the best answer, right? We'll try to approach this webinar with these principles in mind, with these that you see here, right? And it's okay if your situation requires a different set of principles, right? You can take advice with a grain of salt, and I'm sure Jonathan will also have some counterpoints to these. So one of those principles, let's start with the first one, is the test code and app code should be linked together. And especially for Cypress, right? We mentioned that last week in the Playwright webinar. The difference between Playwright and Cypress was that Cypress is a testing tool. Playwright is an automation tool. And with Cypress, it sort of like requires you to have your tests and your application code connected. Cypress does not really work well if the code is detached, right? If you have to perform so-called black box testing. That's not what Cypress is good at. But speaking what the things that Cypress is good at, readability, right? Readability and maintainability is, in my opinion, number one contributing factor to a project progressing slowly. It may not be the execution time, but the project as a whole may be really slow because your maintenance takes time. And part of that maintenance problem can be bad readability. And another principle, testing should improve speed of delivery, right? Something that testers don't really like to hear, and I'm a tester, right? I don't really like to hear that as well, is that in most situations, testing is a liability, right? There's connected maintenance costs, worker cost, tooling, and all of that costs your company money. And many companies make the mistake of looking at testing as a liability and decide to cut budgets, lay off people. That's really like not what I'm trying to say here. That's something that may happen because of misunderstanding of what testing actually does. But the thing is, we as testers, we all understand that there's a value in testing and that without it, things get worse. But let's be honest, we can also make things work worse for ourselves. If testing takes too much time, requires too many people, costs too much, and I mean relative to the size of the company, size of the project, etc., that's when things get bad. And sometimes we're the ones creating that situation. So as we think about scaling up, we need to think about that this aspect of testing, that it actually costs something and it needs to be worth it, right? Testing should improve speed of delivery. It should mitigate risk.
The thing I think I'd want to point out here too, especially in regards to Cypress, right? If we're looking at 2000 plus end-to-end tests, we're looking at 500 plus end-to-end tests, regardless of your parallelization approach, right? This is going to take a very long time. It's going to take a very long time. And if, as a test engineer, QA person that belongs to an entire organization, right, you're a part of the DevOps, workflow. You're a part of the DevOps cycle. It becomes important for when it's your turn to test the code, right, as a part of the cycle. It's important to make sure that you get fast, accurate feedback as soon as possible. If your end-to-end tests are taking 5 minutes, 7 minutes long just to run through some scenario, likely you should refactor this, right? And it's not just because like, hey, we need this to run faster. It's because there are costs to you not focusing on speed, right? The longer a machine runs in CI, especially with Cypress, as it's both the app and acting on the app itself live in a browser, that machine's going to slow down. That machine's going to time out, right? You're extending its life maybe too long, and you'll start to see things like flake pop up, right? So the more that we can focus on testing and test delivery speed as a part of the overall software development lifecycle, it's going to help you not only not raise any red flags or attention to the test org, right? And saying, hey, in CI/CD, when we're running our tests, it takes an hour. Our developers are frustrated. All of our tests are flaky. Our tests are timing out, et cetera. You don't want to get there. So when you're thinking about scaling, you need to approach how you write your tests and how your tests run with this principle, as a founding principle for how you run your tests.
Yeah, that's really well said. We have a question in our chat from Lucas, and he's asking, like, is having the tests in a separated repo an indicator of slowness in the process?
I would love to take this, Philip.
Yeah, take this.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily an indicator of slowness in the process, but what it is an indicator of, right, is a bifurcation of developers and testing having two separate areas of ownership, right? As we think about shifting left over the last 4 or 5 years, if you're still seeing test repos running outside of where the code lives, sure, there may be some good reasons for that. But for the most part, I would look at this as an anti-pattern, right? Everyone's trying to move these tests to live with the app code itself. If you have an exception to this rule, it better be a really good one, especially with Cypress, just like Filip said. Filip?
Yeah, I think you said that really well. The only thing I would maybe add is that whenever you have a separation of the application repository and your code repository, your test repository, you are creating a versioning problem for yourself, right? And a very simple example of that could be that you have a new feature that is being released. You need to write new tests for that feature. Now, when that new feature is getting released, you're going to merge your tests into like your main branch. But what if that feature gets reverted? Then you also need to revert your tests, and you're pretty much like doing this dance with your repository, which you also like need to maintain, and there are problems connected with that. So long story short, I've been there. It's been a hell. So I don't recommend it based on my personal experience. But again, as Jonathan said, if you have a really good reason for doing that, then by all means.
Let's hit one more thing here, then keep it moving forward. I want to be mindful of time. You definitely made a bunch of slides that we got to hit, Philip. Let me touch on this last one real quick. Human time is more valuable than machine time. I think this is an extremely solid take, but I would also challenge it, right? And that human time and machine time are, how can I say, are inextricably linked, right? Because again, if I'm a developer, I'm pushing some changes, and this 500 plus end-to-end test suite runs, and that takes 30 minutes, takes an hour. That's extremely painful, right? It's going to literally cost me my developer time, depending on how large the machines are that are running these end-to-end tests. Like if you're including, videos in all of these executions, you're not using traces, etc., then it's even more expensive. It's going to take even longer, right? If you add on to that, using Cucumber or something like that, that typically adds another 10 to 15% in overall execution time. Whoa, right? All of a sudden, this test run time is costing developer time, and that's even on a successful run. We're not even talking about retries yet.
Oh yeah.
In addition to built-in Cypress retries, we're not talking about people hitting the retry button in their GitHub Actions, right? So all of a sudden, that 1 20-minute test suite that's running, that's super efficient and dialed in, it's exponentially longer than that, depending on how it's being run or how flaky it is. Filip?
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. I think you said that really well. All right, let's move on so we can actually go through all of these slides. So one question that is going to be important as you scale your project is, how do you design each individual test in Cypress? That's the building block of your whole project. So we're going to talk about that for a moment, and I'll try to be specifically addressing the challenges that come with Cypress, right? So the first recommendation here, as you want to scale up, is focus on behaviors. You're going to be focusing on behaviors anyway at the very beginning. What I really like as sort of a guiding principle, I'll be quoting Ken C. Dotz here: the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. And that's probably, as you scale up, those tests are going to resemble your user stories, and you can organize those user stories into folders as shown in the picture, right? Another thing that's going to become more important as your project scales up is the pattern of individual tests, right? I personally highly recommend using the arrange, act, assert model. The reason why I recommend to have a certain model or certain pattern is that whenever you start with test automation, or even if you have a more mature test automation suite, it's really easy to fall into the trap of trying to automate everything. You're having fun, you're writing tests, you can create them really fast with Cypress. I've been there, and you end up sort of going like this crazy monkey all around your repository. Your tests don't make sense, or they do too much, they're too long. That's not something where you want to end up, right? In Cypress, as I show in this code block, the arrange part can be put in the before or before each block, and you can group those tests in that that have the same setup. And as you create more and more tests, those patterns will emerge and will sort of guide you to which tests should be together, right? Because usually that before each is more complicated than what's shown here. I just simplified it so it's easy to read. But in that arrange part, you'll usually seed your database, send a bunch of API calls, maybe log in, maybe do something else, right? And if there are many tests that do the same thing, that do the arrange part, you can group them easily together. Then finally, there's a question of testing patterns, right? Page object model, custom commands, BDD, right? Dry principle. Many of you might have read that you should not use page object models with Cypress, and instead use app actions. The problem with that is no one really knows what app actions are, right? I mean, I read that blog. I'm not sure if I would substitute that, right? But the underlying problem of going for page object model or any other pattern, right, is or the question of should I use page object model? The underlying question is, how do I make abstractions in my project and make sure that as the project scales up, I don't end up refactoring my project every month? And it is a good question that you should ask early, right? As soon as you start scaling up your project. The only problem with that question is that at the time you are asking it, you might not have all the information about the future of your project. So Many of you probably heard about the dry principle. Don't repeat yourself, right? And that's what the page object model is actually all about. And it's hard to say if page object model is a good or bad idea, or that if the dry principle is good or bad. And my advice here, and I know it might come off as weird being said at Cypress at Scale webinar, but don't try to optimize too early. Right? If you try to optimize too early, if you put everything into separate objects or custom commands or whatever, it might be just you guessing today what will happen in the future. I want to be more specific because I would like to show you how this sort of premature optimization usually happens.
One second.
Oh, sure.
Can you go back
to
the last slide real fast?
No problem.
I just want to chime in here real fast, right? That in Cypress's own documentation, in terms of the page object model, it says something like, "Yeah, you can, you don't have to," right? And I honestly, I'm a big advocate for that. Also, if any of y'all already follow me on LinkedIn, I am staunchly against BDD. I'm not against it. I just think that who owns the test, right? Like when a test fails, who's going to be the person to fix it or, respond in the app and address whatever bug is occurring? A developer is, a test engineer is. So who are we writing our tests for becomes extremely important in test design, right? If page object model is something that helps you very quickly understand what's going on in your tests, and developers understand it, and the people that are debugging things and fixing the tests can get with it and get it really quick and can resolve errors fast, adopt it. Absolutely do it. But if you're writing your test for non-technical stakeholders and it's costing you time and debugging, remember that foundational principle, right? Human time is more expensive than machine time, right? And this is where our organizations start losing velocity when we start making these sorts of decisions as maybe a way that we think we're scaling, but in reality, it could be something that holds us back fairly quickly, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I want to give a example of how this sort of premature optimization can happen, right? So let's say we have this simple test and I want to open this 3-dot button that's over here, right? It opens the menu and there's an item that I want to click on. So, going with the dry principle, I'm going to create my custom command and I want to abstract that logic, right? So I create a custom command called open menu, and that is going to click on that button and then find a menu item and click on it. Great, we have abstracted. We can reuse that in all of our tests. So far so good. But then our application progresses, right? Now we don't only have one item in our drop-down menu, but we have two, right? So what do? We'll keep this abstraction and add a parameter. So now we can pass the name of the item we want to pick from the menu, right? So we've added a contains command. Now we can take a look into which items are there, and we can click on the right one. But as we progress, we now have multiple of these 3-dot buttons in our view. And we want to still reuse our application. We're still opening a menu. So we're going to introduce a condition that will enable us to decide whether we want to open the board menu or the list menu. So that's based on that condition, we're going to fill in the selector, which will then get passed to the get command, and then we proceed with the rest of the command. And then we have another problem because there can be multiple to-do lists in our application. So now, not only we have two different types of 3-dot buttons, but we actually can have multiple of them. So what we will do, we'll add a index number so we can actually pass the index of the item we want to click on. And now when we look at our custom command, it has gotten way too complicated, and it's probably a good time to refactor it. But by this time, the abstraction has become incredibly complex. And looking at this, I know this is not the best representation of incredibly complex, but you know what happens when you write tests, right? Things get messy. I've been there. Things can really get messy quickly. So with the refactoring, though, we have a problem, right? So we have all these tests using this abstraction, and it started off as a good idea, right? Let's take the thing that repeats and put it in one place, right? But also, when we change the abstraction, what's going to happen that it is going to affect all of our tests. So why am I talking about this, right? As your project will scale, these kind of situations may start happening more often, and they are going to get harder and harder to mitigate. So when we talk about the test design with the mindset of scaling the project, it's really worth to be aware of what is an industry good practice and what is an actually good practice for your project. Because as we just demonstrated, a seemingly good practice has the potential to turn into a nightmare, right? And I'm going to circle back to the Cypress documentation about custom commands. Even they do the recommendation, don't try to turn everything into custom command. And I fully support that, right? Your test should be first and foremost readable. And that's where we get to the readability, right? So why readability, right? Because when you write a complex test that does a very complex thing and it finally passes, it feels like a victory until you need to open that test again and debug what's wrong, right? So there's a reason why developers have peer reviews and focus on writing good code. No one wants to refactor or add functionality to garbage code because they're afraid that something will break. And same goes for tests. Now, selectors can be a big part of this readability problem, right? There are different approaches. This is a screenshot from Cypress documentation where they give you a recommendation on which selectors you should be using and which ones you should avoid. At the top, or rather at the bottom of this of this image, is the custom data ID or data CY selectors, which you can add to your code. I think there's another great recommendation, and I see that Playwright is going full swing on this one, is the accessibility selectors, right? And these are actually really great because not only you can make sure that you have all your accessibility selectors in place, but they'll actually give you a confidence that the things that can be interacted with do have those labels and those properties that they should have. It also makes your test readable because if you want to find something by label, you can read what that label actually is. And also, you can combine approaches, right? That's fine. Just make sure you have a good readability. Another part is test annotation, right? That's an aspect that should not be overlooked. So when a test is passing, as long as it's doing what it is supposed to be doing, that's great, right? But when you have to maintain it, that's a whole different story. You need to understand what's going on. So in Cypress, you have this Mocha syntax with this it blocks, where every it block is a test name. And maybe it's not you who wrote the test that needs to maintain that. If you have a name like this, it's really hard to say what the test's intention was and when you get an error that like this element was not visible or something, it's really hard to pinpoint what kind of problem happened in that particular test. So my advice here would be to make sure that your test annotations are more verbose and actually tell whoever reads the code about the intention that's behind the test, so that they know that if a test failed, that test fails because that intention behind the test actually fell. Being able to navigate through the code efficiently is going to make a huge difference to your project that contains more tests, more people contributed to it, And also providing a good documentation can help you with that a lot. Usually, a good documentation contains at least 3 important parts. First of all, installation of the projects, right? If you have a new team member, that's a great way to test if your documentation is written well or not, right? Let them read it and let them set up everything by themselves. Can they do that? Great. They struggle? Maybe there's something that needs to be added. Also, good documentation has explanations, recommendations, examples, documentation on custom commands, and so on. And then finally, pull request rules, right? If you want to contribute to the project, what are the ground rules? What do you need to make sure of? Do you need to update anything beside the code? And these can be added to the platform you use, so they don't necessarily have to be part of the like readme.md file, but it's really good that if you can guide people through what's going on as they progress and as they contribute. All right. So let's now move up to the project design. We talked about each individual test, and then we're moving on to the whole project, right? So one of the superpowers of Cypress is the ability to expand your command library by custom commands. I usually like to think of custom commands as being in 3 different categories. First of them is utility commands, right? So those are like your small utilities that help you test stuff. So I don't know, get by data ID, sort of a wrapper around the get command. Get clipboard, right? If you have a clipboard button and you need to like enter what was passed into the clipboard. Get tooltip if you need to test like pseudo elements and stuff like that. Those are your utilities that make your job easier as a tester, or can help with the readability of the actual code. Then another category is API calls, right? You can create sort of wrappers around a certain API like login or see data or stuff like that. And a third part is the action sequences, right? But as we shown just a couple of slides ago, don't overcomplicate it with action sequences. So I have an example of a custom command on the right side, and as you can see, sorry, I just stuttered here. As you can see in this custom command, it is actually full of TypeScript annotations and a bunch of weird stuff, right? If you're not used to TypeScript, then this might be a little bit hard to read. But let me take you through that, because there are many good things happening inside this custom command, right? So this single command will take care of auto-completion, right? So we have declared the types. We have essentially added this command to the Cypress toolset, or the Cypress library. Then we have the correct types for parameter and return types. So whoever uses this custom command will have an easy enough time to understand like what needs to be passed into this function and what this function will actually return. So in Cypress, with the chaining syntax, if you're using your custom command, you can actually pass on the proper data to the next command and avoid misuse of, I don't know, click on something that doesn't return a DOM element, but instead returns data or something. And then JS documentation. I think that's my favorite when it comes to custom commands, because it's essentially a documentation inside of code. So this looks like a comment, but that comment will actually pop up whenever you use your IDE, and you can actually learn about how that command is supposed to be used. What does it do? And passing this information through your repository is going to be incredibly useful for the rest of the team as well. All right. Wait, sorry. Yeah, okay. As far as the organizing of custom commands go, usually a place for your custom commands is in the commands.js file, right? But as you scale up, my recommendation would be it is so much better to organize them in a separate files and store them in its own folder, as is shown here on this slide. If you are in a monorepo situation, it's really handy to create your own library of commands, which can then be imported and used across different projects. I had experience with that. It worked really well because if we needed to have like custom logic, especially for those API custom commands, those were really useful. We could see the database or send some data somewhere through every project that was inside the monorepo. It was pretty sweet. And then finally, one other tool that can be great for keeping up with the project growing is code coverage. In this example, I have just a simple visit command, and it already covers 25% of the application. This also demonstrates the power of end-to-end tests, right? And why we like them, because they can do pretty well job of covering the application just by few simple commands. And code coverage gets a bad reputation. Usually there's a story of a non-technical manager trying to chase numbers and traumatizing the whole team. But what I think it is really useful, and I really think it's useful to think about it as sort of a undiscovered map areas. So anyone like strategy games, Age of Empires, Command and Conquer, stuff like that? I've been playing those for last days. It's been a lot of fun, right? When you have those undiscovered areas, you know what you don't know, and code coverage actually can be a great tool for that. Because as your project gets bigger, it's impossible for like one test manager to keep track of every user story being covered by tests, right? And on the other hand, it also provides information of the areas in the app that are being over-tested. So yeah, code coverage, good stuff.
I wonder though here, right, as we're talking about, again, Cypress at scale, and earlier we were talking about test design and BDD and all that type of jazz. Like, again, if we're solving this code coverage problem, it means that the organization has grown to the point where someone's curious about this, right? As a solo dev, like, yo, you can log in, you can send some money. Let's just make sure that those two things work, and that's how I'm going to approach it. Again, like, code coverage is this very sort of like mature use case for really wanting to understand, like, our app is big now. Our app does a whole lot, and yeah, we have 100 tests, but are those tests touching every part of the application? Right? This becomes very sort of prominent when you start getting user reports about bugs coming in, right? Like, oh, we don't have a test for that. We don't have a test for this. We don't have a test for that. That's when people start really wanting to look at code coverage, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not functionally covering the areas of the application that your users are encountering. So I personally despise looking at these reports, but I also know that they're valuable. But again, like, we're talking about scaling, so it's not about me not liking these. It's someone else is trying to solve a different problem, and being able to generate a code coverage report for that person to be happy and maybe to talk to their bosses so that way they get a little less stressed out. This is what scaling is, right?
Yeah, for me also, like, running my first code coverage report has been really interesting, because suddenly I saw what my tests are actually doing in terms of like covering the code, right? And I've seen that some areas are really over tested, and some areas, oh, I actually missed this use case that would be a problem if that didn't work. So yeah. I'm a big fan of this. I actually do enjoy this. So I'm on the other side of that love-hate spectrum for
it comes back to something you said earlier, right? And it's that your tests hopefully are mimicking your app's functionality. So when I'm creating tests, essentially I have it kind of set up just the way my app is, right? If there's a login page, I have a login test spec, right? Or an entire directory dedicated to logging in or payment or whatever those use cases are. And I'm hoping that in mirroring the app's functionality, if I do a code coverage report, I'm not surprised, right? Unless it's something I don't care about. And I hate to say that because we care about everything. But again, thinking about velocity, how many people are actually doing testing in the organization? Who actually cares about this right now? Where can you and the team be most effective? Is it generating a code coverage report and making sure all this is at 100%? Or did y'all make some choices that require some heavy refactoring and you got to put a whole person on that just to get something out of the door, right?
Yeah, it's also like, I think it's good to point out that with tests, essentially you're trying to mitigate risk, right? If there's a feature somewhere in your code or functionality somewhere in your code that no one ever uses, should you write a test for that? I would argue no. I have better things to do with my time because there are other really important things that need to be covered, right? Maybe it's also a good indication that maybe that functionality needs to be like deleted. So yeah. All right. Moving on to running in CI. So Cypress really pushed hard on this idea of running your tests, end-to-end tests on your pull requests or even on every commit, right? It came at a time where, Cypress is already like, I don't know, 8 years old, 10 years old, I forgot. But at the time, if you look back, CI/CD pipelines were just like getting integrated left and right in the companies. So Cypress hopping on this was actually really smart. And as your project grows, you may get to a point where you have your tests integrated into a CI/CD pipeline, and before your build would finish in 1 minute, but your end-to-end test would run for, I don't know, 10 minutes, right? But now it's grown up to 45 minutes and everyone hates that. And once again, we're in a situation where testing is becoming a liability because it doesn't improve the speed of delivery. It actually works against that. So a very nice way of dealing with that is to start tagging your tests. And this is actually one of those things that is good to think about really early because as you scale up, the need for tagging your tagging your test emerges. It can be a fairly long process to start tagging your test from scratch. So if you start tagging your test on day one, maybe you could add, like I used the smoke here, but maybe it could be something like production only or something like that, or dev only, I don't know. Then that could be really, really useful. And as your project grows and matures, it will be really useful because you can pick and choose which tests to write. Elise here, right, is running 2,000 tests. I'm not sure if you, by the way, that's a question for you, Alice. If you are running 2,000 tests on every commit, I'm suspecting that's not the situation. But maybe it is. I don't know. But at some point, it makes sense that you don't run all of your tests on every comment or on every pull request, but only at certain times, right? Because if you want to try to mitigate risk, you don't have to do it all the time, every time, because then it comes at a certain cost. Another good area to have in mind as the project scales up is the configuration, right? So here's an example of how a configuration might look when you sort of pass a different version of your tests. You can use production or staging or QA area, stuff like that. Chances are you might want to run the same tests against different environments, right? Reasons could be various, right? Because your API got updated and you need to run a full regression for everything. But like just on the experimental version of your build, right? Maybe you have spun up a new environment. Maybe you want to run your tests in production. Basically, anytime you want to run pretty much the same test multiple times, it's good to move that to that command line interface level, right? Just pass a flag and then run all your tests with that parameter in. As you see in this code, we can run different versions like production, staging, just by changing a flag, and then we'll read a bunch of information from a JSON file. But there are many different use cases for that, right? Same goes for stuff like running against multiple languages or any type of high-level stuff. This enables you to be prepared for situations where your e-commerce store diversifies to another country and so on. I could name a couple of examples where that will be useful, and to be prepared is very useful as well.
What I'd like to add here, right before we keep moving forward super quickly, is, I think it's also very important to think about things like, are you running video, right? I think since Cypress 13, Cypress is saying, like, if I'm not mistaken, the video default is off now,
Yeah.
right? So no longer recording video. Why is that? Because of Cypress Test Replay, right? Which is a paid for feature. And I think that's totally fine. They're doing their thing. Nice. But what becomes important is that you start thinking about, again, who's running and who's debugging these tests. Are you paying for Cypress Cloud? Are you paying for a solution like Replay, which is a really great value and a great tool? But I think what I would mainly want to double click on here is things like whether or not you're recording video, whether or not you're doing compression, how those things impact your run in CI, how those things also impact the agents that are actually running the tests themselves, right? Because doing video compression or image compression is actually a pretty expensive task. So you could be trying to save, some bandwidth on a machine by, doing compression, but really you're actually maxing out that machine's resources right at the end of the test, and then you lead into a hang. So being critical about, hey, am I recording video? Am I taking screenshots? Am I logging all these errors? Am I using something? I think there's a open source package called Cypress Trace or something like that. Am I kind of putting it together that way I can optimize on speed versus optimizing on, hey, I want to get all these details every time I run my tests? You have to think about it. And if you're a test engineer writing these test suites and you're not thinking about this, it's going to come back to you, just kind of like we said at the very beginning. It's going to come back to you, because what's going to happen is a month from now, when the developers get their hands on your tests, so they're supposed to own them, I'm putting air quotes here, right? When they're supposed to own them and those tests take forever, or they start failing and flaking because of whatever else is going on, they're going to wonder why they're using XXL large machines for tests that are failing, right?
Yeah. All right. So moving on to the next point, running on CI, right? Finally, as your project grows in size, right? in size, it is time to make sure that your tests run fast enough, right? We mentioned that already. Running in 10 minutes versus running in 45 or 4 hours. I don't know. Even if if at your journey you're still not there, and you have just a couple of tests, it is actually really good to think about running your test in parallel from day one. Why is that, right? If you have a test that creates stuff, one that edits stuff, and another one that deletes stuff, you need to ask yourself if they're not going to interfere with one another if they don't run on the same machine, because that can happen, right? Another thing about parallelism when we are talking about Cypress is there's this myth that you need to pay for running in parallel, which is kind of unfortunate since that's not really true. It is true, however, that Cypress provides a paid service, and that one of the selling points is that you can run your test in parallel. But what the Cypress Cloud service does is that it makes the parallelization easy and records analytical data on your test so that you can load balance them, right? But you don't have to do that if you can instrument your own parallelization, and there are like really cool plugins to help you to do so, right? One from an ex-Cypress engineer, Gleb Bahmuto, and it's called Cypress Split, right? This command that you see is pretty much all you have to do besides like actually installing the plugin in order to split your tests evenly across multiple parallel machines, right? So you don't really get that benefit of load balancing but you do get to split that pretty much automatically. If you need load balancing, then you need to do that yourself, right? You need to instrument that yourself, but there's plenty of ways of how you can configure this plugin.
I would
And
add, unless you have an image for it, I would add just with what Cypress Cloud does, is that actually perfect, right? It actually takes this a step further, because when you're using Cypress Cloud, essentially what it's doing is every time a spec is run, it's keeping track of how long that spec has taken to run over time. And I think it's like something like the last 50 or 100 runs or something. You'll have to talk to someone who works at Cypress to know. But what this means is that if you have, spec 1 and it takes 5 minutes to run, and you have 3 other specs and they take a minute to run, right? What's going to happen is that spec 1, the one that takes 5 minutes, which is confusing why I use that naming convention, it's going to be assigned to one machine, right, on its own. And then the other tests or specs will be assigned to the other available machines, optimizing how fast all of your tests run in parallel. Now, you can try to do something similar, but it's actually a pretty advanced sort of use case, and it's unlikely. I mean, you can run your tests fast, right? We all know how to use Docker. We all know how to orchestrate things. I mean, maybe not all of us, but we can figure it out, right? The internet's a wild place. I think we can figure it out. But out of the box, Cypress Cloud, without you having to put the effort into it, is able to just get this done, right? And so when we talk about scale, is it worth you and your team's time to figure out a parallelization process, right? Does your organization value testing in a way that, hey, we'd rather our test engineers, our automation engineers, to focus on anything else? We'll pay for that subscription. Great, right? But these are the sort of things that I think, Filip, brilliant way to just kind of put this all together here. These are the sort of things you have to think about at scale, right? I've gone from my 10 tests that maybe I'm instrumenting on my own and they're running really fast, to I have 2,000 tests. I have 2,000 specs. I have 500 specs. How am I solving this problem? Because if you're not solving this problem, you're slowing down that part of the software development lifecycle, and no one wants to sit with you at lunch, right? Everyone's going to be really upset with you when they see you. Filip, any thoughts here?
No, I think you said that really well. The graphical demonstration on these 2 slides is like really subtle, right? If you have a Cypress Cloud, that load balancing is being done for you, right? If you instrument that yourself, everything is split evenly, right? So if there's any changes you need to make in order to make your tests run faster, you need to do that to yourself, and that's the value proposition from Cypress Cloud. All right, let's move on to the final part of this webinar as we are reaching out the top of the hour, and that's maintenance and development costs, right? So as your project grows, it is important to think about the cost of maintenance that you're introducing with every new test that you will write. This graph may not look like this for you today, where the most of your time is being taken by debugging and less of your time is taken by writing tests. But it may as well look like that later, and driving down that debugging and maintenance time is going to be quite important, right? So that's why today we are talking about stuff like readability, and not about like which frameworks run the fastest on CI, right? But when we talk about testing and test code, we cannot really skip talking about the application under test, right? So all that we said today might be useful, but as you scale up, you're still going to be hitting some flaky tests, right? And they're going to add to your debugging time and to your testing time. And for those situations, you need to make sure that you have a proper insight into how your test is ran and what it actually did. So it's good to make a stop and talk about what flakiness actually is. And I want to demonstrate that with a following example, right? We have just 2 commands in this Cypress test. contains number 1 and contains number 4. And if I were to run this test against this stopwatch application, this test would pass, right? Even though we have numbers 2 and 3 in between and lots of different numbers running in the over here in the milliseconds area, right? This demonstrates that there's interaction happening between the test script and application under test, right? So when flakiness happens, it's actually a disconnect or desync between the test script and application under test. When flakiness happens, it usually happens in between those commands. The app was doing something that the test was not expecting or is not really accounting for, and then sometimes it passes, sometimes it doesn't. Really depends on how on like various different aspects, right? So whenever flakiness occurs, yeah, it can happen in between those commands. So debugging a test flake is mostly looking at the application and getting a good understanding of what is happening inside, right? And that's why I've been talking to testers about getting more technical and getting better at understanding of what the application code what the application code does, as it is crucial when you're doing debugging, right? And having that understanding will actually drive that debugging time down. And we have been seeing like growth of these different tools that pop in and help you with debugging tests. Cypress has actually come with test replay that brings all the goodies of the Cypress open mode into the CI, so you can actually debug your CI. And coming from replay, I have to give shout out to replay that's been doing test recording, so you can actually not only dive into the test script, but into the application script as well, into the application as well, and debug your code line by line. And on that note, we're pretty much reaching the end of this webinar. So thank you very much for coming, but we'll still hang out a little bit more if you have any questions. And yeah, Jonathan, if there's anything you want to add, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this has been really interesting. I think, again, you've approached it from this space of primarily looking at it around testing at scale versus a true focus on solely Cypress at scale. And I think that's extremely valuable. I think the audience has been really great at asking questions and chiming in with, their use cases and their questions. And I think that's always like one of the best things you could ask for here. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, right? Like, what does at scale mean to the audience, right? Like, who in the audience right now feels like they're working on a project that's either scaling actively or is currently at scale? And I think Alice obviously is working on a project that's at scale. She's solving at scale problems.
Yeah, she's been started the show today. Like she won the competition of who has the most tests.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you asked a great question, right? Like, how many of those tests are you running at a given time? There's no way you're running all 200. Like, how valuable would that be? And I think that sort of deeper dive around, hey, it's a monorepo. We're only running some of these tests, most of these tests, some of the time, et cetera. Like, that becomes really important. And I think as a testing community, it's important that we align on that, right? Like, you've shared some quotes from Kent C. Dodds, et cetera. I think one of my favorite quotes is from Guillermo Roche from Vercel, right? Like, test.
Right, test, not too many, mostly integration. Yeah.
Sorry, I got a little fog here. But I think that's cool. And I think it's awesome that we're having this discussion. And obviously we're very much, hopefully we survive to have another day and we can continue talking about testing in the future.
Same here. Thank you, Jonathan, for being here and joining me on this presentation, webinar, live stream, and thanks for everyone who came in, shared their share their questions, and we'll be wrapping up. Stay tuned. There's more to come. We'll see what kind of format, whether we'll be doing more webinars or whatever. By the way, if you want to catch me or Jonathan, you can find us on LinkedIn. I'm going to just share those QR codes, those little ones that are next to our heads. Those are our LinkedIn codes. But if you want to take a look at the presentation, you can check out that. It's all online. It's even on my GitHub. So if you want to contribute or I don't know what, then feel free to do so. Anyway, thanks again, everyone, for coming in, and we'll see you next time.
Catch you later.
Bye bye.